Went for folklore, found hell. Locals started a hunt for the outsider. Will he survive? Dinner had barely settled when the young folks from the settlement, gripped by a sort of wild, almost hysterical energy, swarmed towards the ridge, a grim hill looming over the outskirts, covered in grass of a startling toxic green. Their laughter rang too loud, bordering on shrieking, and Caleb sensed something brittle beneath the rowdy display, a poorly hidden fear of the encroaching night. Hardy girls with feverish complexions traded sharp words, elbowed each other, and shot quick, assessing glances at the rough-edged boys in simple trousers and shirts bleached startlingly white. A fiddler, dragging a rickety stool behind him, planted it by the dirt track, sat down, gave the crowd a sharp, knowing look that held something unsettling, and drew his bow across the strings. A frantic, almost pained melody screeched from the fiddle, seeming to electrify the gathering. The girls yelped. The boys grabbed their hands with a rough possessiveness, pulling them onto the flattened grass where something began that felt more like an ancient, frantic ritual than a simple country dance. This wild whirling stirred the dozing landscape. Startled grasshoppers launched themselves into the air. Ladybugs lifted off leaves as if fleeing some unseen doom. Even the tireless ants seemed to sense the thick tension. Their neat lines dissolved into chaos, tiny bodies scattering as if sensing catastrophe. Caleb moved away from the group and sank onto the grass, feeling acutely like an outsider at this primitive celebration, humming with dark energy. A folklore student from the city, he fought down the irrational urge to jump up and run, forcing himself to observe, to absorb. He'd intentionally separated from his university group after a minor clash with his advisor claiming illness. But truthfully, it wasn't just stubbornness keeping him here. It was Willa, a local girl whose behavior, initially seeming like simple rural flirting, now filled Caleb with a deep, gnawing unease. He scanned the churning, shouting vortex of bodies for her, but couldn't pick her out. Suddenly, an almost imperceptible shift occurred. The noise lessened, the movement slowed, as if an unseen hand had muted the frenzy. Caleb looked around and saw her almost immediately. Willa stood near a dilapidated fence, idly pulling petals from a white flower. A nearly silent presence beside him made Caleb jump. A light touch on his thigh. He looked up. "Willa." She sank down beside him, deliberately close, her scarlet skirt spreading over the grass like a fresh bloodstain. She pressed her shoulder against his, and the wave of her scent, heavy, cloying, a mix of wild herbs, sweat, and something else feral, inexplicably alarming, enveloped him. A shiver traced its way down his spine from her gaze, dark, bottomless, seeming to pierce right through him. It wasn't anticipation. It was the clammy chill of primal fear. Her hand covered his, cool but surprisingly strong. Her fingers tightened slightly more than necessary. A smile touched her lips, but didn't reach her eyes. "You folks always party this hard?" Caleb managed, his throat dry. "When the work's done," she replied evenly, her voice flat. Noticing the disapproving stares of some older women nearby, she shifted slightly away, but then, with pointed slowness, drew a long blade of grass across his forearm. His skin prickled under her touch, not from the tickle, but from a sharp premonition of danger. "You staying long?" she asked quietly, a strange, unreadable note in her voice, regret or threat. "No, leaving tomorrow." "Day after, maybe." He lied again, unsure why. She snapped her head up, her stare from beneath lowered brows suddenly sharp as a shard of glass. Her lips thinned. "Suit yourself, then," she tossed out coldly, crumpling the blade of grass and throwing it down. She sprang up with startling speed, the hem of her skirt whipping against Caleb's face. He was certain it was deliberate. Without another word, she turned and walked swiftly away, her red silhouette swallowed almost instantly by the deepening gloom. Caleb sat there, stunned and angry. The last vestiges of the forced merriment around him faded, leaving only a silence thick with unspoken menace and a syrupy rising anxiety. He got up, intending to head back to the cabin where he was staying. But a strange cocktail of bruised ego, inexplicable fear, and a morbid, burning curiosity propelled him after her. He found her again by the same old fence. Her back was to him. "Willa!" She spun around. There was no trace of her earlier peak. Her eyes blazed with a wild, almost rabid excitement. She let out a strange, shrill giggle and bolted towards the dark tree line of the woods. Caleb froze for a second, struck not by her grace, but by the unnerving, unnatural ease of her movement. She seemed to float over the ground. The flash of her red skirt between the pale birch trunks was like a warning flare. What awoke in Caleb wasn't the thrill of the chase, but the panicked dread of prey, realizing it's walked into a snare. But his feet carried him after her. He plunged into the trees, her laughter echoing around him, growing higher, more piercing, losing any human quality. The flickering red of her dress, the flash of her bare feet, the intoxicating scent of her skin mixed with the damp decay of the woods. It all pulled him onward, deeper into the thicket where the air grew heavy and the light faded. He was almost upon her, his hand reaching out to grab her shoulder. Then a scream tore through the air, not hers, someone else's. A man's choked inhuman sound of ultimate terror cut off abruptly, followed by a sickeningly loud crack like a thick branch snapping under immense weight, and instantly a wave of thick, cloying sweetness. The stench of putrefaction, so dense it felt physical. Caleb burst into a small clearing and froze, his blood running cold. Willa was huddled on the ground, hands covering her face, her body shaking violently. And directly above her, swinging gently from the broken limb of a gnarled old oak, hung a body. In a crudely fashioned noose, bloated purplish-black bare feet dangled, swaying slightly in the still air. Caleb forced himself to look up. A hanged man. Middle-aged, his body already showing signs of decomposition. His face was swollen and discolored, a grotesque mask. Eyes closed beneath puffy lids, yet they seemed to watch. Lips stretched back from blackened gums in a horrifying rictus. The tongue, swollen and dark, lolled out. Dried spittle glistened on unshaven cheeks. Yellowed, broken toenails on hairy bare feet completed the vision of utter horror. But worse than the sight was the smell. The overwhelming, suffocating stench of decay hung in the air like a shroud, soaking into his clothes, his skin, clawing at the back of his throat. Caleb gagged, his head spinning. He saw Willa scramble to her feet, recoil from the corpse, and then, without a glance his way, flee back through the woods, crashing through the underbrush. An hour passed, feeling like an eternity, before grim-faced men from the settlement arrived. They cut the body down with difficulty. It took them a while to recognize the swollen features. It was Jedediah, Jed, a quiet, reclusive local widower. As the body, wrapped in rough burlap, was carried back towards the settlement, a crowd gathered. They didn't weep or cry out. They stood silent, huddled together, and their silence felt heavier, more ominous than any lament. Caleb, still nauseated and shaky, overheard the low, venomous whispering of two old women standing apart from the others. Her again. Took him. Bad place, this. His folklorist curiosity, now welded permanently to a chilling dread, made him approach him. Excuse me, do you know what happened here? His voice trembled slightly. It's the woman in the woods, son, rasped one, fixing him with faded, sharp eyes. Not no kindly spirit, mind. This one's spiteful. They say a girl, long time ago, was forced to marry a man she hated. Hanged herself right here on this tree. Her spirit ain't rested since. Comes for the menfolk, especially widowers. Happened in the fall, they say. That's why her hair's red, like dead leaves. That's hogwash, Miss Aggie, hissed the second woman, older still, wizened like a dried apple. That ain't no woman in the woods. That's a haint from the swamp. Her man never come back from the war, see? Died of grief right out here. And now her lonely spirit wanders, looking for company, dragging men down with her. The two women began to argue fiercely, their words like fragments of some ancient, terrifying lore, full of dark warnings. Caleb scribbled frantically in his notebook, the familiar symbols now looking like cryptic runes, charting a path to damnation. You're both fools? Cut in a third voice, quiet but carrying immense authority. Another old woman had approached unnoticed, tall, rail-thin, dressed in severe black, with eyes that burned like dark coals. Granny Rowan, someone whispered nearby. It's the witchery, she declared, her voice raspy but firm. From Blackwood Hollow. That cursed place over the ridge. Their blood's bad, always has been. They prey on our men, especially them that's lost their wives. Just like Amos 3 years back. Wife wasn't gone a year. Moped around, he did. But he told me the truth. Her eyes fixed on Caleb. Come to me one night, wild-eyed, whispering. Clara, he says, my Clara comes to me. At night, holds me. I told him, cross yourself, fool, pray to the Lord. That ain't Clara, but he wouldn't listen. Right before the end, he come running again, talking about a wedding. Can you believe it? Me and Clara are getting hitched tonight, out in the woods. Come be our witness, Granny Rowan. Pale as a sheet he was, but his eyes shining with some unholy light. I told him again, Clara's dead and rotten, boy. Get hold of yourself. But he just waved me off. Found him next morning, swinging, right here, same tree. Think he did it himself? Never. Amos loved life. Something evil got him, something from Blackwood Hollow. The old women resumed their bickering, but Caleb barely heard them. A tremor ran through him. How do you get there? To Blackwood Hollow? He asked, compelled by a dark impulse he didn't understand. Why you want to know? Granny Rowan narrowed her eyes, her gaze sharp enough to pierce stone. Through the woods. There's a path, easy to spot. Just follow it straight. Woods will lead you out to the deep timber, then you'll find the track to the hollow, but I wouldn't go there if I were you, boy, she added, lowering her voice to an ominous whisper. Them folks, they ain't like us. Their ways ain't our ways. They don't take kindly to outsiders. You go there, you might not come back. Caleb mumbled his thanks and hurried away, feeling the weight of their stares on his back. He spent the night tormented by vivid, suffocating nightmares. The next morning, defying common sense, driven by a blend of mortal fear and the scholar's obsessive need to understand, he headed back into the woods. The locals watched him go with open hostility. When he asked about the path to Blackwood Hollow, they either met him with stony silence or claimed ignorance, though the fear flickering in their eyes told a different story. He wandered the woods for hours. The sun beat down. The air grew thick and stagnant. There were countless small trails, but they all twisted and vanished into the dense undergrowth. None matched Granny Rowan's description. Exhausted, sweat-soaked, Caleb sat down in the shade of the very oak where they'd found Jet. He tried not to look at the broken branch, but the horrifying image burned behind his eyelids. The heat and weariness overtook him, and he drifted into a heavy, uneasy doze. He was jolted awake by a nightmare. Icy, skeletal fingers closing around his throat, squeezing the air out of him. He woke with a choked gasp, clawing at his neck. The fingers were gone, but the phantom pressure, the feeling of suffocation, remained terrifyingly real. And something else. The intense, almost physical sensation of being watched. Right now. someone hidden among the trees, observing. The air around him felt thick, electric with tension. "Hey, anyone there?" he called out, his voice thin and shaky. "Who?" The reply floated back, a lilting, feminine voice, laced with mockery and something else, something chillingly inhuman. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The old women's tales flashed through his mind. The woman in the woods, the haint, the red hair. Nonsense, just nerves, Caleb muttered, but his heart hammered against his ribs. "Ahoo!" the voice called again, and deep among the trees a flash of fiery red. Hair. Caleb went cold. Superstition or not, every instinct screamed danger. He scrambled up and started running, back towards the settlement, towards safety, away from that laughter, away from this accursed wood. Behind him, branches snapped loudly. Someone was following, making no effort to be quiet. The girlish laughter erupted right beside him, high-pitched, devoid of warmth, filled with a cold, malicious glee. Caleb broke into a panicked sprint, heedless of the branches tearing at his clothes. Feeling the icy breath of pursuit on his neck, trees blurred past, he realized with dawning horror that he was utterly lost, running deeper into the menacing tangle, not towards escape. Panic seized him in its freezing grip, and then she was simply there, directly in his path, as if summoned from the shadows. Red-haired, laughing. He cried out and stumbled backward. His legs gave way, and he collapsed against the rough bark of a massive pine, gasping for breath, unable to look away. Her beauty was startling, unnatural, disturbing. Skin like porcelain, dusted with fine freckles like rust spots. Huge gray eyes that stared, unblinking, unnervingly direct. Thick, fiery red hair cascaded around her shoulders. She was too thin, too fragile-looking for this rough country. She seemed conjured from mist and moonlight. The woman in the woods? The hollow witch? Caleb sat frozen, his mind blank, unable to recall any prayer, any protective charm. "Where are you off to in such a hurry, handsome?" she asked, her voice like wind chimes, yet it sent a wave of nausea through Caleb. "Didn't take a liking to me, running away?" No, I'm just lost," he stammered, feeling like a fool. "That's so? Well, happens." She laughed again, that same chilling, splintered sound. Who are you?" he forced himself to ask, trying to inject some firmness into his voice. "I haven't seen you around the settlement." "That's 'cause I ain't from your settlement." She smiled, revealing small, sharp teeth. A predator's smile. She slowly ran a hand through her fiery hair, and it seemed to writhe with a life of its own. "From Blackwood Hollow?" The question was out before Caleb could stop it. A surge of fear mixed with a scholar's perverse curiosity. She nodded silently, her heavy, hypnotic gaze never leaving his face. "What's your name?" "I'm Caleb," he pressed, desperate to break the oppressive silence to gauge her intent. She smiled again, lowering her lashes coyly, but her silence felt weighted, ominous. "Why won't you tell me?" "No time for chatter, Caleb. I came looking for you." She lifted her eyes again, a cold calculation in their depths. "Heard tell you're collecting stories? Wanting to know about what happens to menfolk out here in the woods? Looking for the truth. How did you—" "Yes, I am," he admitted, feeling a chill creep up his spine. "I can help you with that, but there's a price." Her voice turned silky, insinuating. "What price?" he asked warily. "We'll get to that later. First, you tell me what you need to know." She seemed to be enjoying his fear, playing with him. The folklorist's drive for knowledge warred with his primal fear. Knowledge won. "I need to know who or what is killing the men in these woods." "The risen dead," she replied with unnerving casualness. "Old thing. Comes to widowers looking like their dead wives, lures 'em in, then takes 'em. She's buried out here, in the den. Head west off this path, you'll find Bald Knob Clearing. Hole under a crooked pine tree. That's where she crawls out from. To put her down for good, you gotta climb in that hole, find her coffin, and drive a sharpened stake right through her heart, all the way in. Her words sounded like cheap horror fiction, but she delivered them with such chilling calm, such matter-of-fact certainty, that Caleb felt a terrifying conviction bloom in his gut. She was telling the truth. A grotesque, impossible truth. Right. Thanks, I'll think about it, he mumbled, slowly getting to his feet, backing away. Nothing to think about. Come on, I'll show you. She stepped towards him, holding out a slender white hand. Caleb hesitated. Go with her? To that grave? To face the undead? But the thought of missing this chance, of touching a real ancient horror, overwhelmed his fear. He nodded numbly and, feeling like a condemned man walking to the gallows, followed the red-haired girl as she slipped effortlessly, silently between the trees like a phantom. They walked for maybe 20 minutes. She led him to a small bleak clearing choked with scraggly brush. In the center stood a gnarled, twisted pine, and at its base gaped a dark, ragged hole in the earth. It looked less like a den and more like a festering wound, exhaling a palpable cold and the sickly sweet odor of decay. The opening was just large enough for a person to squeeze through. Caleb stared at it, the cold dread solidifying in his chest. The girl's wild story suddenly felt horrifyingly real. There's the den. Get in. Find the coffin. Use the stake. The girl repeated in the same flat tone, pressing a smoothly sharpened stake into his hand. It felt heavy and cold, slick with something he didn't want to identify. Caleb took it numbly. Nausea rose in his throat. Climb in there? Willingly? Into that stinking grave? I need to think, he stammered again, backing away from the hole, from the palpable aura of death and despair radiating from it. Think fast, the redhead smirked. If they find out you were here, that you know about the den, you won't leave the hollow alive. You're an outsider, and outsiders in Blackwood Hollow meet bad ends. Remember that. Caleb gave a jerky nod, unable to speak, turned and fled, crashing blindly through the undergrowth until the woods gave way to a darker, denser, unfamiliar forest. He stumbled onto a faint trail and followed it, not knowing where it led, but feeling the girl's burning, hateful stare on his back every step of the way. It was near dusk when, utterly exhausted, he reached the edge of a settlement, Blackwood Hollow. The name itself felt like a curse, a grim, oppressive place. Sagging cabins that seemed to grow out of the earth, their windows like vacant eyes, yards choked with weeds and junk, a heavy, hostile silence broken only by the croaking of crows. The few people he saw moved like shadows, their faces gaunt, their eyes filled with suspicion and a dull resentment. When he tried to speak to them, they turned away or stared through him with open hostility. He understood. The redhead hadn't lied. He was an outsider here, and he was not welcome. He needed to get out, fast. He found a collapsing shed on the edge of the hollow and decided to hide there until morning, hoping to slip away unnoticed. Deep in the night, low, furtive voices outside the shed woke him. He pressed his eye to a crack in the warped boards. Moonlight illuminated a small patch of ground. 3 figures stood there, 2 burly, rough-looking men, and the old woman, Granny Rowan. He recognized her instantly. Gone? You sure he ain't here? The city fella? Her voice rasped, sharp with malice. He's here, Granny Rowan. Fresh tracks by the shed. Willa saw him nosing around the den, just like you said. One of the men growled. Then he knows. Can't let him leave. He smells our troubles. Means he's tainted himself. One of them. We'll take him at sunup, quiet-like. Put him back where he belongs, down in the den with the others." Caleb's heart plummeted into an icy void. They knew he was here. They were going to kill him and throw him into that pit with the undead thing. He held his breath, terrified to make a sound until the voices faded away. Panic obliterated thought. Run. Now. But where? Back through the hollow was suicide. There was only one conceivable path, insane as it seemed. Back through the woods, to the den. Maybe there was another way out through the hole. Maybe he could hide there. Slipping out of the shed, he hugged the shadows, moving swiftly back towards the forest, towards the Lichgate clearing, which now seemed, paradoxically, his only hope of escape. He stood once more, before the black maw beneath the twisted pine. Fear rooted him to the spot, but the distant sounds of pursuit from the hollow, shouts, dogs barking, spurred him into action. Clutching the stake like a talisman, he squeezed his eyes shut and plunged into the darkness. He had to drop to his hands and knees, then flatten himself completely, wriggling forward like a worm. The concentrated stench of mold, damp earth, and the sickeningly sweet odor of rot filled his nostrils, gagging him. He crawled into absolute, suffocating blackness, feeling like he was being buried alive. Dirt crumbled from the ceiling, clogging his nose and mouth, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Waves of panic washed over him. Unknown horrors lay ahead, certain death lay behind. The tunnel narrowed. Soon, Caleb felt his shoulders wedged tight against the packed earth. He struggled, twisted, uselessly. The earthen vise tightened. His chest felt crushed. His lungs burned for air. Choking, he thrashed wildly in the confining darkness, scraping his hands raw, desperately trying to move forward, backward, anywhere. The darkness felt alive, pressing in, suffocating him, draining his last reserves of strength. Consciousness began to slip away. Just then, the passage unexpectedly widened. He gasped, sucking in a ragged breath of foul, stagnant air, and forced himself onward. He emerged into a slightly larger underground chamber, barely visible in the utter blackness. Almost immediately, he heard a groan. Low, long, filled with inhuman agony and malice. He froze, ice water flooding his veins. The groan came again, closer. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He crawled forward cautiously, the stake held out before him. His fingers brushed against something cold, damp, yielding. He snatched his hand back as if burned. Another groan, right beside him now, and a distinct rustling sound. Something was moving towards him across the dirt floor. Caleb knew with sickening certainty he was not alone in this grave. It was here, the risen dead. Consumed by a primal terror, he forgot the stake, forgot the plant, forgot everything but the desperate need to get out. Up, towards air, towards light. He began clawing frantically at the ceiling above him, tearing at roots, dislodging clumps of earth. Dirt rained down on him, filling his eyes, ears, mouth, but he dug like a maddened animal trapped in a burrow, driven purely by instinct. Finally, his fingers broke through into emptiness. He tore at the opening, pulling himself up, and a shower of earth, stones, and rotted wood collapsed down on him, nearly burying him alive. But through the dust he saw a patch of night sky. Escape. He scrambled out of the hole like a cork popping from a bottle, greedily sucking in cool night air, coughing and spitting out dirt. He lay on the grass, unable to move, his body racked with tremors. Then he heard it, a hideous scraping, scrabbling sound from the hole behind him. He forced himself to turn. Emerging from the ravaged opening, writhing and convulsing in the faint moonlight, was it? The decomposing corpse of a woman plastered with dirt and mold, swarming with pale maggots visible through the tatters of burial clothes. It moaned softly and clawed at the edge of the pit with skeletal fingers, trying to haul itself out. The sight was so monstrous, so fundamentally wrong that Caleb screamed, a high-pitched, thin shriek of pure terror. Forgetting his fear, propelled only by revulsion and the instinct to survive, he fumbled in the grass for the stake, grabbed it, scrambled to his feet, and lunged at the thing. He stabbed at it wildly, again and again, putting all his horror and disgust into the blows. The stake sank into the putrid flesh with wet, sucking sounds. Dark, foul-smelling ichor sprayed out. The risen dead twitched and writhed like a severed worm, still reaching for him with decaying hands, tipped with long black nails. Caleb kept stabbing until the stake struck something hard. He threw his weight onto it, feeling ribs crack beneath his hands. The thing let out a last long sighing groan and went limp. Caleb yanked the stake free, stumbled back, and collapsed, vomiting violently onto the grass. He sat there, empty and shivering, trying to grasp what had just happened, when the red-haired girl emerged silently from the trees like a phantom. She was holding his backpack and notebook. "I knew you could do it," she said with a faint smile, as if he'd just completed a difficult chore. "You put her back down. Your debt for the knowledge is paid, but maybe you could do one more small thing for me?" Caleb lifted his head, staring at her with dull, uncomprehending eyes. He couldn't speak. She came closer, offering him his belongings. "Let's get you cleaned up. You're filthy." She took his arm and led him, unresisting as a sleepwalker, towards the stream that murmured nearby. Caleb fell to his knees at the water's edge and began frantically washing himself, scrubbing away the dirt, the gore, the slime of the grave. The icy water shocked his skin but couldn't cleanse the contamination he felt deep inside. He rubbed his face and hands until they were raw, desperate to erase the touch of death. When he finally rose, trembling from cold and shock, Willow was sitting on the bank, watching him. She beckoned him closer with one finger. He obeyed, moving like an automaton. She reached up, ran a hand through his wet hair, and looked deep into his eyes, her own pupils seeming to swirl with an ancient, unknowable light. She leaned close, her lips brushing his ear, and whispered so softly he barely heard it over the sound of the water. "All I want from you is your love, forever." She pulled him down and kissed him. Her lips were cold as ice, but the kiss was demanding, possessive. In his ravaged, exhausted mind, everything blurred. The residual horror, the bone-deep weariness, a strange, morbid fascination with this terrifying, inhuman creature. He realized she was naked beneath the thin shawl she wore, her white skin glowing faintly in the pre-dawn light. His hands moved of their own accord, finding her slender waist, sliding up her cool, smooth skin. It all felt dreamlike, unreal, yet somehow inevitable. The only possible conclusion to this nightmare, or so it seemed to him then. And then she was gone, simply vanished into the dissipating mist, leaving Caleb alone by the stream, shattered, hollowed out, feeling irrevocably tainted. He collapsed onto the grass and fell into a deep, black, dreamless sleep. He didn't wake until dusk the next day. His body ached as if beaten, his head throbbed. He felt broken, defiled, changed forever. He painfully gathered his backpack and notebook and, without looking back, stumbled away from the cursed woods, away from Blackwood Hollow, away from the memory of the risen dead and the icy kiss of the red-haired witch. He thought the worst was over. He thought he had escaped. If only he could have known then what dark, tenacious chain of horrors he had set in motion that night. What lightless gloom would now cling to his heels for the rest of his days. He would have howled, a long, hopeless, despairing cry of a cornered animal, choking on his own terror and doom. But he didn't know. He just walked on, away from the forest, carrying within him the chill of the grave and the phantom, burning cold of a kiss on his lips.